Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, Canadians right now are busy collecting tax slips and preparing to file their annual income tax returns. And, Mr. Speaker, despite the fact that no Canadian loves to pay income tax and no Canadian particularly enjoys the act of complying with an increasingly onerous tax system, we can take comfort and be proud that we live in a country where most taxpayers do honestly report their income. Respect for the rule of law is a foundational Canadian value, but the biggest threat to a culture of compliance is the notion that other people or businesses do not comply. So as tax evasion threatens the legitimacy of the entire tax collection system. If Canadians see that some Canadians succeed in evading taxes, other Canadians will resent the fact that they are paying and complying because they know that they will have to pay even more as a result. Furthermore, this past fall, the Auditor General tabled a report that pointed out the challenges that the Canada Revenue Agency has faced with collecting taxes from those who have offshore transactions. The Auditor General found that people or businesses with offshore transactions were given months or even years to comply with requests for information from the Canada Revenue Agency, and sometimes just had their cases dropped with zero taxes collected or assessed. And this is while regular Canadians are automatically reassessed and penalized after 90 days if they fail to respond. So this report from the Auditor General confirmed what many Canadians have suspected, and that is that there is a serious problem with offshore tax compliance and that some wealthy people have advantages that normal Canadians do not when it comes to avoiding taxes. So while compliance is the norm in Canada, some will underreport their income and others will not file returns at all. The underground economy of unreported cash transactions and the use of overseas tax havens are assumed to create a multi-billion-dollar gap between what the law requires Canadians to pay and the amount which the Canada Revenue Agency actually collects. And I say assumed because there is no real estimate of this gap. Bill S-243 seeks to measure, report on, and hold the CRA accountable for its efforts to eliminate this tax gap. As the Opposition Shadow Minister for National Revenue, I'm pleased to join a multi-party effort to address the tax gap by sponsoring Bill S-243 in the House of Commons. This bill was introduced in the other place by Senator Percy Down of Prince Edward Island. It was amended at the Senate Committee on National Finance and was passed with all party support. And I hope that colleagues from all parties will support and swiftly pass this bill in the House of Commons as well. In my remarks today, I'm going to address what this bill does, what it does not do, and why it's important for Canadians. Bill S-243 does three things. It requires the Canada Revenue Agency to publish distinct lists for convictions for both domestic and overseas tax evasion, to calculate and report on the income tax gap, and to give the Parliamentary Budget Officer information needed to calculate the tax gap for an independent assessment. So the bill starts by instructing the Canada Revenue Agency to publish distinct and detailed lists of convictions for tax evasion within Canada and overseas. As the Panama and Paradise Papers demonstrated, overseas tax evasion is a significant problem for Canada. Canadians might be shocked to know that years after the revelations contained in those data leaks, no charges have been laid. They might also be shocked to know that according to the Canada Revenue Agency's own information, there have been less than a dozen successful prosecutions for tax fraud and evasion in the past year. And that's in a country with some 30 million annual tax filings. Law-abiding taxpayers deserve to know what the government is doing to enforce the law equally and to crack down on Canadians who illegally hide money overseas, as well as those who refuse to report their income at home. Presently, it's difficult to find such information, and details are not provided. Publishing two separate lists will help Canadians to understand the extent of overseas tax evasion and will spur efforts by the Canada Revenue Agency to bring cases to trial in a timely manner. Canadians should never feel that the wealthy and well-connected can evade income tax without consequences. Bill S-243 also requires the Minister of National Revenue to calculate and report on the income tax gap every 3 years. This allows the CRA 3 years in which to gather all applicable data, analyze it, and release a reasonable estimate of the difference between taxes owing under the Income Tax Act and those that they actually collect. Analyzing and calculating the tax gap is an involved process which will take time, so a 3-year reporting cycle ensures that measurement and reporting do not consume a disproportionate amount of their resources. The 3-year cycle also allows time for increased effort to combat tax evasion to take effect and for a long-term trend line to be plotted. Finally, the bill instructs the minister to collect, compile, analyze, and abstract statistics on the income tax gap and provide that data to the parliamentary budget officer. As such, he can verify the CRA's work and offer an independent opinion on the tax gap. Combined with CRA's reporting, this should allow a reasonably accurate estimate of the tax gap to be charted. Bill S-243 mandates that the minister consider certain factors in calculating the gap, such as the value of reassessments as a result of audits on individual, corporate, and trust returns, and the rate of incorrect returns which were not detected until being audited. But it does not limit consideration to only these factors. It explicitly states that the calculation of the tax gap is to be based on such factors, but with flexibility to consider other things as well. The bill does not address tax avoidance schemes that are legal under the Income Tax Act or instruct the CRA to calculate potential revenue from amendments to the Income Tax Act. This bill does not mandate particular tax compliance efforts or targeting of any classes of taxpayer for greater scrutiny. It only aims to gather the evidence on which to base tax collection decisions, and it leaves those decisions to the government of the day. The bill does not infringe on Canadians' privacy. Likewise, the material which the CRA must share with the parliamentary budget officer is subject to privacy protections which prevent identification of individual taxpayers. This bill does not create new taxes. It does not modify existing taxes, nor does it change tax treatment. This bill is an effort to identify the extent of tax evasion to ensure that existing laws are being equally enforced. So I'd like to address some of the observations that were raised by witnesses at the Senate Committee on National Finance and by stakeholders with whom I've consulted. Witnesses pointed out that Bill S-243 could make Canada a world leader in legislating measurement and reporting on the tax gap. Other countries are experimenting with measurement methodology, but none have written the reporting requirements into law, so Canada has an opportunity to be a world leader in understanding the scope of its tax evasion problem and be better equipped to address it. Mr. Speaker, this is a problem that faces countries throughout the world. It's not unique to Canada, but Canada can and should take a leading role in addressing this problem. And despite the fact that such reporting is new, I am confident that Canada's public servants are up to the challenge of developing a practical methodology over the next 3 years. A further suggestion made at committee involved giving the parliamentary budget officer access to anonymized underlying tax data instead of just the CRA's own analysis of tax data. This would allow the PBO to generate a more precise independent opinion, but that would require amending the Income Tax Act to address privacy protections, and that while I agree greater precision from the PBO is desirable, such an amendment is beyond the scope of this bill. Some witnesses thought Bill S-243 didn't go far enough and thought that it should be expanded to include measuring tax avoidance in general rather than just tax evasion, and that it should address evasion of other taxes, like the goods and services tax and excise on liquor and tobacco. But this bill targets only the gap between income taxes legally owed under the Income Tax Act as written and income tax revenue collected. Measuring tax avoidance would be more complex than the measures contained in this bill and will have to be left to other legislation in the future. Witnesses also told the committee that participants in the underground economy often evade multiple taxes at once. A business that neither collects nor remits GST, for example, almost certainly fails to report the income that they receive. And I agree that other forms of evasion involving GST or excise duties such as contraband tobacco should be measured and reported as well for an accurate picture of the overall general tax gap. However, income tax is a reasonable place to start to measure the tax gap. Right now, none of this is measured at all. So at least this bill, with this, we can begin to measure the tax gap by starting with income tax. Personal and corporate income taxes account for 2/3 of the total tax revenue, and so this is a good place for us to start. And there's certainly nothing in this bill stopping a future parliament or a future government from expanding the measurement and reporting system to include other taxes and duties at a later date. Some stakeholders raised concerns that moves to measure and report on the tax gap would spur efforts by the agency to target law-abiding taxpayers, in particularly small businesses, with sterner enforcement measures. And I understand this concern, and in general, I share it. But I think that it's misplaced in the case of this bill. The issue of overzealous tax collection measures is a separate issue. And it's one that this Parliament could have dealt with by establishing a legislated duty of care between the agency and taxpayers. But this House chose not to do so when motion M43 was voted on in September 2016. That this bill does seek to improve Canada's ability to measure how effective our revenue collection and law enforcement systems are. It seeks to promote better governance through better information. The issue of the CRA's treatment of law-abiding taxpayers is a separate, unrelated issue. This bill does not mandate any particular enforcement actions. It does not single out any class of taxpayers for further attention. It does not amend income tax policy to close perceived loopholes or to raise anybody's tax burden. It is simply a measure to uphold the rule of law. It aims to gather the information needed to ensure that all Canadians comply with the law, that no one can evade it due to wealth or overseas connections, and so increase the burden on those who comply. By requiring the CRA to post distinct lists of both foreign and domestic tax evasion convictions, it will likely focus greater compliance attention on overseas tax haven use. And that's good news for honest Canadian businesses. Mr. Speaker, Bill S-243 will improve Canadian governance through better information. It will allow Canadians to see how effective tax collection and law enforcement efforts are and to demand better. It will provide successive governments the information that they need to address domestic and overseas tax evasion more effectively and to provide the impetus to give offshore tax havens the enforcement attention that they need. It will provide the evidence for evidence-based policymaking. It will demonstrate Parliament's commitment to the rule of law and to treating Canadians equally and permitting none to cheat, thus increasing Canadians' overall confidence in our institutions. And it will increase accountability from the Canada Revenue Agency through independent reviews by the Parliamentary Budget Officer. This is important for small businesses who so often feel like they are the lowest hanging fruit for compliance scrutiny. They have watched, as the Auditor General has pointed out, how those with overseas transactions are sometimes given months or years to comply and maybe just even have the case thrown out, while a small business person with a only domestic business has only 90 days. So it's important for law-abiding taxpayers of more modest means to see that the wealthy and the well-connected using tax havens are brought to justice. And this is important for large companies and wealthy individuals to know that Canada upholds the rule of law. No one likes paying taxes, Mr. Speaker, but Canadians like cheaters even less. And this bill will show Canadians that parliamentarians of all parties take such cheating seriously. It will show them that Parliament takes steps to understand the scope of the problem and to better address it. So I encourage colleagues from all parties to support this bill, grant its swift passage through the House, and make sure that we maintain our culture of compliance and a culture where people believe in their institutions, have confidence in their institutions, and are willing to comply with the tax laws that currently exist. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. L'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Sherbrooke. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his initiative and his speech. When we start this bill, the Senate public bill, which has 3 very valid objectives, and I'm very happy that my Conservative colleague is joining this movement to ask for greater transparency at the CRA and also in the calculation of the tax cap and the transfer of information. Like my Conservative colleagues, I'd like to know more about what happened between when the Conservatives were in power and today, because the PBO fought for quite some time to obtain this data, and he finally managed to receive a positive response from the current government. But the PBO even threatened to go to court to get this data, particularly because the Conservative government under Stephen Harper absolutely did not want to provide this information to him. So can my colleague shed light on what happened between when the Stephen Harper was in power and what's going on today, and why you're in favor of this?
Well, I am not going to comment on what happened in the previous Parliament. I was not a member of the previous Parliament, and but I will say that there remains a reluctance at the agency, even now, to provide information. And I am pleased that things seem to be moving in the right direction. I hope that, to begin with, I hope that members of the government side will support this bill. I hope that information will get to the PBO, and that the PBO will receive the information necessary to independently verify the accuracy or provide a separate opinion from the CRA, and we will see, first of all, if the bill is indeed supported by the government, the government and the governing party members, and I just hope that we continue to move in the right direction on this, and to be able to measure accurately the tax gap so that Canadians can have confidence in our institutions and the fairness of their institutions.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
So thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you know, it is somewhat interesting. The member across the way didn't really want to comment on the former administration. But what we have seen with this government is a very aggressive approach in terms of looking at ways in which we can recover taxes. We've literally seen close to $1 billion. That's hundreds of millions of dollars over 2 consecutive budgets, Mr. Speaker, to try to recover millions and millions that have been people that have been avoiding and paying their taxes. Yet the Conservatives actually voted against that. So I find it somewhat interesting. Now they're saying they have this bill, which actually originates out of the Senate. And my question to the member is, when they talk about the publication, what sort of information? Can you give us some specifics? What do you want CRA to actually publish?
Member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
I'm going to start with his preamble and then lead and answer his question. In his preamble, he congratulated his own party for, I guess, what he is characterizing as the great work it's done in collection, which they measure only by the amount of money they spend. That's how they measure action, I guess, on that side. I wonder if the member actually read the Auditor General's report that was tabled this fall, wherein the Auditor General said there was no evidence that any of the additional money spent had any successful or tangible result. The report remarked on how the agency treats those that that have offshore transactions differently than domestic taxpayers. And this government is in the 4th year of its mandate. It has its own track record now, Mr. Speaker, and the Auditor General has revealed just how poorly this government has done, despite the money that it has spent on overseas tax avoidance and evasion. 11 convictions and sentencing events in the last 12 months. 11 out of 30 million taxes filed. So there is no really nothing to, well, I want to answer his question though, Mr. Speaker, and he asked about what information to be provided. Right now, we don't know who has been convicted. We don't know whether they are foreign or domestic, and the current minister mixes those two in her answers and replies in this House. So we want specificity with the reporting of conviction, whether it's domestic or